Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the part two of our epilepsy workshop. I'm here with Frankie. Um, yeah, thank you all so much for coming. So I have a lot of content today, and I'm so grateful to have you all here. We'll try to we can get through all of it. We have an hour and 50 minutes together. If we can get through all of it, that'll be really impressive. I'm not going to try to rush us through anything. So anything that we don't get to, we can always follow up offline, or maybe we'll even consider having a third workshop in the new year. Doing anything else in the rest of this year is, I think, unrealistic since we're so close, getting so close to the holidays. Oh, I didn't update this date. We know today's November 22nd, not the 15th. Yeah, less than a month, or just about a month away from Christmas, days away from Thanksgiving. Um, but yes, so today I'm going to do a yes, and then introduce ourselves. So I we have some new people here that weren't here last time, so thank you for coming. And if you haven't had a chance, the we sent out a summary of the workshop last time, and there's also the recording, which is 2 hours. So I don't really expect people to listen to that unless you're really interested. But and then I'm gonna do a bit of a summary here too. So hopefully that'll catch everybody up. I'm Nicole Vasilevsky. I'm the Associate Director of Data Science at the Critical Path Institute. I think I know everyone on this call for the most part. And Sabrina Toro is the lead biocurator for the Mondo disease ontology and is now at University of North Carolina. We'll be facilitating this workshop today. And so yeah, our agenda is just to do welcome, which we're doing now. So the logistics will be here for until 10 till 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. We've shared the code of conduct with you in advance, and it's also linked from these slides. And then we'll do some introductions and then dive in again. I'll do a summary of what we talked about in part one. We were able to implement, I think, almost all the changes that we discussed in part one. So, and the release has come out since then. So you should be able to see those in Mondo now. And then we have a lot more questions for this part two workshop. And just so you know how I colored the slides, anything new, I have kind of like a blue background, and anything that's covering what we previously talked about is in this kind of purplish color. Um, I started doing that just for my own keeping track, and then I thought I should just share that with you too. So if you want to know the method to my to my madness in my slides, that's kind of how it's arranged. So yeah, let's get started. So yeah, this was the kind of the workshop goals overall. So in the last one, we talked about how to contribute to Mondo. So there's content in the recording and in the slide deck above. If you're in the slide deck, you can scroll above and see that. There's also, if you have any questions about how to contribute to Mondo that isn't clear, definitely feel free to contact us. And we're also going to, after this workshop, and after we make these next round of revisions into Mondo, we're also going to set up another system that was developed by Julie McMurray in our lab, who created this really nice like kind of template where you can really easily review the terms of the ontology and make comments. It's like this kind of fillable form. It's a little hard to describe. Um, we'll send it. We'll create it and send it around later. So we will probably be following up with everybody later with additional like, is this really what the right thing kind of questions? Many more opportunities to provide feedback kind of asynchronously later. Yeah, today we're going to continue with reviewing the upper level classification of the epilepsy disease branch and the alignment with the International League Against Epilepsy. We got through a good chunk of it last time, but there's still some open outstanding questions. And then I have some really specific questions about key terms of interest that have I've added into the slide deck. And then yeah, our overall arching goal is just to build collaborations and strengthen the community with the epilepsy experts in the field, just to ensure that we're building this ontology and representing the disease entities in the most appropriate way and scientifically sound way possible. Yeah, thank you to everyone who attended the workshop last time. Here's a list of the attendees who are able to join us. And yeah, the recording is available on our website, along with these slides are also posted. So yeah, recap where we left off last time. So yeah, we're trying to align Mondo with the ILAE, and this is their figure. So they classify epilepsies by seizure types, epilepsy syndromes, and epilepsies by etiology. We did not discuss seizure types because these are all classified as phenotypes in the human phenotype ontology. We did go into a lot of discussion about epilepsy types, and based on what we discussed last time, we implemented a lot of new revisions to the ontology. So on the left here is our original hierarchy of what we had as the higher level classes under the epilepsy grouping class. And I created a legend here to indicate here on the right, this is the new hierarchy based on the revisions that we discussed. So the new terms are orange. If we relabeled a term or reclassified it, it's blue. And if we just reclassified it, it's purple. So we added these new terms. We have combined generalized and focal epilepsy, which auto-classifies as a child of focal epilepsy and generalized epilepsy. We added this new generalized epilepsy term because we didn't have that before. We just had generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus. And then we added generalized or genetic generalized epilepsy, and then a child of that hereditary generalized epilepsy. And then we classified some of these terms um, some of these auto-classified according to the kind of the inference from the ontology, or we would classify them. We asserted these classifications based on our discussions. And one thing to point out here is that we actually had this idiopathic generalized epilepsy it was just labeled a little bit differently. And then we ensured that these four classes were classified under this per our discussions. And yeah, so like I mentioned, we actually had um, idiopathic generalized and epilepsy in Mondo, just named as generalized epilepsy, idiopathic. And it also in Mondo previously it referred to an epilepsy with an idiopathic origin, but we removed this because our definition of idiopathic, which is defined as a disease with an unknown cause, did not align with ILAE since they had this as a child of um, genetic generalized epilepsy. And then we ensured that just these four classes were classified as children of this. There were some other children classified under this in Mondo, so I reclassified those into other branch or just removed this as a parent of those classes. And then another question that I had after doing these revisions for the combined generalized and focal epilepsy, um, juvenile myoclonic epilepsy is currently a child of combined I think it's auto classified to be a child of combined generalized and focal epilepsy, and this is based on this current parentage that this juvenile myoclonic epilepsy has. It has these several of these parents here, um, and this is getting inferred because of the assertion that it's a adolescent adult onset, or that it's getting inferred to be a childhood electroclinical syndrome because it has this adolescent onset, adult onset epilepsy syndrome. And this is inferred because of this assertion of familial partial epilepsy. So in the ILAE, they classify juvenile myoclonic epilepsy as a child of only idiopathic generalized epilepsy. So I propose that we remove all these other subclasses that are coming from other sources, and then these inferred subclasses will go away, and it'll just be a child of idiopathic generalized epilepsy. So that's my first question. Does anyone feel any strong reason that juvenile myoclonic epilepsy should be a child of adolescent adult electroclinical syndrome, adolescent adult onset epilepsy syndrome, familial partial epilepsy?
Yeah, hey, the thing is
Hey,
that I think that not I don't think in the latest classification of the epilepsy syndromes they removed the category of adolescent adult onset syndromes at all, and
yeah,
many things that are have been listed there are now under variable
yeah, exactly. I
category,
agree. Yeah,
and it's just not existing. So probably the overall this category would require revisions later on. But I do agree
hmm
that if we are following strictly ILE rules, we
hmm
could take it out of there.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so this one's no longer there. Yeah, now it's variable age, like you said. Okay. if there's no objections to this proposal, I think we can move forward with that. Thanks, Alina.
So maybe a question,
Sure.
just me, just in general, what the ILE does is not necessarily the best way, especially when it comes
Oh.
to genetic syndromes. It's
Uh-huh.
very outdated. This is like a commission of people who are 50 years and older, like on average, not very cutting edge, just by the nature of the high ranks they have.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So genetics is very progressive. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, it's also not, I don't want to get into details, but just to keep in mind that some of the things may not make completely sense from a, more biological focused approach. Not so sure, because I wasn't in the first meeting, how should we comment on things like this? Should we strictly follow the ILE flow, or
Yeah.
what makes more sense maybe for rare disease, because that is often more biologically oriented?
I think we should do the latter. Sabrina, do you agree? I don't think we need to be strictly following ILAE. We were just kind of using it as a guideline since we're not the
That
experts. So we're like, yeah.
yeah, I agree. Whatever is the way that the current the current expert think of the disease, this is what we should follow, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah.
So the other thing is that all the ILA classifications, like people are writing reactions to them. So for Dennis's point, in the genetic
Mm.
space is like we're writing reactions that they're not covering official, like well, when it comes
Mm-hmm.
down to like ontologies and what the actual community and even clinicians use. So we probably don't want to like have the ILA as the Bible. I think we, in terms of people who are using the data and putting the data in, that's kind of where we want to go, because there are definitely people who are writing reactions to this and just saying it's not covering what we need it to cover.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And
Okay.
ultimately, we hope to write like a report and publish like a paper describing our workshops and our decision making here. So if we feel comfortable, we can put this into a paper too, kind of our reactions to the ILAE and how we've come together and come to different types of consensus if we feel like that's appropriate.
Can I ask you one more questions? So I'm sorry, I don't want to
Please.
make this like, but is it okay? Or if the time is pressing, I can also keep it.
Oh no, this is the whole point for us to ask questions. So
So
yeah.
when I look now at juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, just by the name of it, this is not an adult, right? So it's like a juvenile epilepsy.
Yeah.
It's also childhood, so it's like people. I don't know the exact range, but I think it's like 12 years to 15 years or so. That's the age when
Mm-hmm.
that person is presenting with it. So my question is now, if someone had the syndrome, so if for you, for example, how to use Mondo in this context. So if someone is 30 years old and he had the characteristics of the disease by the age of 12, should the Mondo term be used as that this is a juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, although that person is not anymore juvenile, right? So
Right.
that person might have now a different epilepsy, which is a result of the juvenile epilepsy that person had at that time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. We'd have to look at how it's defined. So if it said juvenile is defined as an onset at age 13 or older, then I think it would be appropriate. But yeah, when annotating any terms using Mondo, you really have to look at the definition and see how it's defined to see, then kind of make a
Okay.
call if it's
So,
appropriate.
so
Yeah.
that is a note. So the other thing what I see here is it's not a partial epilepsy, so it's a generalized epilepsy. So it's familiar
Mm-hmm.
partial epilepsy. It's not correct.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it would also fit under the genetic syndrome. And so this is where it becomes a little bit blurry.
Mm-hmm.
Because how you define genetics, because this is a highly heritable polygenic epilepsy, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not a monogenic epilepsy.
Yeah.
So here's also where ILE is not really progressive, and how to put it, and then the geneticists might disagree how to approach this. So so what is your stand on this?
That's a great question. We do have a whole slide about kind of how we can better classify the genetic epilepsies. So if you don't mind, maybe we can wait till we get to that slide, because that's going to be kind of a big discussion. Because yeah, right now we just kind of have epilepsy, and then we have monogenic epilepsies right now. So we haven't really done a great job of classifying and kind of differentiating between different types of genetic epilepsies, but that's something that we're trying to address in this workshop today. So
Yeah, and to make it more complicated, so
Mhm.
so people can with JME, that's the abbreviation, right? Can have a polygenic load with like which gives you fourfold risk developing it, or they could have a copy of a variant, particularly 15q13 1.3, which give them 20-fold risk developing it, or they can be genetic negative.
Yeah.
And they can be sporadic or come from a family where in every generation 3 people have genetic epilepsy. So you can classify them based on the genetic architecture very differently.
Yeah.
So that depends really how the categories are, the rules are, how to put them into these categories.
Yeah, we do have a separate inherited disease susceptibility branch. So if they had some mutations that predispose them to GME, we could have a separate class for that. But then if they actually have, they have the disease and they have a known genetic component, we could classify it separately from that. We do often create classes that are the familial, the hereditary form versus the non-hereditary form. But then, yeah, the whole way we classify genetic diseases of epilepsy and Mondo in general is something that we're going to address in a few slides down from now.
Okay.
These are great questions, Dennis. I love it. Thank you. And Alina, you had your hand up. Did you have a further question?
I think it was all resolved during the discussion. Just had a couple of comments. You commented on everything.
Great. Okay, so yeah, we'll come back to the genetic questions, which are really great. Another question I have is about electroclinical syndrome. So I noticed this is not in the ILAE, but now we're realizing that we don't need to strictly follow the ILAE. But I'm wondering if this term is still a valid grouping class. There's on the actual term in Mondo, it links to this website that says this was a term that was added to the ILAE at some point, but I can't see when this article was published. They're referencing some older articles too. So yeah, my question is this still a valid term? Do we want to keep it as a grouping class? Or should we follow what ILAE is currently doing and not including this as a grouping class and obsolete it from Mondo? Does anyone have any opinions about this?
Can you remind me what the scope of Mondo is? So for me, I just naively don't know anything. I was always under the impression that HBOs is more like symptom and the characteristics of a person, whereas Mondo is more like describes a syndrome and so encompasses everything. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. Mondo is meant to represent the disease and syndromes and disorders.
So in that context, the electroclinical syndromes features, so like absence seizures, absence epilepsy, myoclonic epilepsy, and so on, they are typically more. I personally would think about this more like HBOs, whereas unless it's like a specific JME, for example, myoclonics, juvenile myoclonic, that is then more a syndrome and that fits more Mondo. But this is so looking at this here, and there are probably a couple syndromes which are electroclinically defined, but an overall like absence epilepsy that's too broad. That is not Mondo style. That's more HBO style, I would feel.
Oh, interesting. So does that suggest that we should get rid of the electroclinical syndrome and maybe even get rid of absence epilepsy in Mondo and just have this be an HPO? I can imagine the absence seizures are already in HPO.
Yeah, I think there is no how we think about epilepsy. This is more like a symptom, which is for the classification, but it's not a syndrome level. Yeah, so if you go into this, you describe the patient with one disease name, you would not say absence seizures, absence epilepsy. This is because it's more
because they're having the absence seizures. Yeah.
Most of the epilepsy is described by epilepsy type, seizure type plus age. That's like a general rule of thumb how they're described. And unless they become rare, and then they are described more based with weird names because of some specific features of that thing or the inventor.
Nice.
think I
Um,
agree primarily. Like, my interest in Mondo is really trying to diagnose newborns with genetic syndromes, and I think at
mhm,
times the electrocrinical symptoms um could be all that's described early, but I sort of overall agree with Dennis. I think of it as like an HPO term that helps you get to
mhm.
a diagnosis. But
Yeah,
I we all agree. I just always hate throwing things out that could still be helpful, but
yeah.
Yeah.
We could also just add comments to the term too. Say this is, more of a collection of, of phenotypes. I mean, this is kind of how it's defined here, even a collection of complex clinical feature signs and symptoms that together define a distinctive recognizable clinical disorder. Like
To
as like a
Curtis's point, the the symptoms in absence seizure, a patient could have absence seizures before they're diagnosed with a structural um, etiology, and those could evolve over time where they have become partial seizures that generalize. And so there's there's a longitudinality to it.
mhm,
As you learn more about the patient, and as the patient ages and has goes through puberty and all the fun things. So I think the seizure types, and some, the genetic epilepsies have multiple seizure types as well. So the electroclinical aspect of things often is a sequel is part of the and the neurologist can speak to this better than I can, but it could be part of what we first learn and then get the diagnosis, but it could also be something that changes over time as
mhm,
as the patient ages. So
mhm,
learning what that goes under is uh I think a challenge for folks who are not the clinicians.
mhm.
Yeah, and just just in general, with epilepsy, it's all these names, they have a timestamp.
Yeah.
Something what for this and that, and in a 5-year-old, it's often called very different in an adult. And
Mhm,
this is changing now a little bit with the genetics becoming more on the forefront. But in general, there is no perfect terminology, and and I think there's always like a decision to be made when the HBO is the better strategy versus the Mondo. And they're often very much correlated.
right.
The goal for Mondo is just to have basically better labels and ICD codes also. Um, then I think one needs to really differentiate between HBOs.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's something that we're definitely it's on our radar where we're needing to differentiate between the phenotypes and the disease entities. Um, Evelina?
Yeah, just by exploring the hierarchy there, the ontology, I think that there is lots of overlap between different categories. Yeah, and what's
Yeah.
categorized under irregular clinical syndrome overlaps with other categories as well. The question is how much we lose if we just take the category out. I think
Yeah.
all the children terms are situated elsewhere, so it's
Mm-hmm.
just semantic discussion. I think
Mm-hmm.
it could be weaned just because all the other things they are covered elsewhere
Mm-hmm.
without conflict in terminology.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. Thank you for checking on that. So, do we feel comfortable with obsoleting this term? Does anyone have any objections to doing it? And when we obsolete something, we will wait. We'll put it on our GitHub issue tracker, and we won't act on it for a couple of months. So we'll have other people have opportunities to give feedback to. Okay, I think for the record, we can say let's consider obsoleting this since it doesn't seem to be an appropriate actual disease. And then like I said, we'll put it on the issue tracker and we'll wait a few months before we take action. And also we don't like, it's not preferred practice, but we can always re-implement terms later too if it becomes something that's used again. Okay. Another discussion we had at the last workshop was the epilepsy of unknown type. So in the ILAE, they had focal, generalized, combined generalized, and focal, and then they had epilepsies of unknown types. And so yeah, we've added these. We have these terms kind of corresponding to the ILAE, like generalized. We have not depicted, but we have focal. We have the combined the combined generalized and focal. We discussed whether or not to add epilepsy of unknown type, and we decided not to. We think it's best if someone's annotating, if they're annotating data from a patient and they don't know the type of epilepsy they have, it's best to just annotate to the top level epilepsy term versus having a term that's epilepsy unknown type. Just by the nature of the ontology, if we're doing queries across the data, if you annotate to the high level term, if you're querying across the data, you will get all this all the children term. If you're saying like what all the types of epilepsy, if you annotated the term epilepsy of unknown type, that kind of is a leaf node with no children classes, then it would kind of affect the way the data could be analyzed. So
Can I comment to this? So
yeah.
So the branches we see here is like generalized, focal, right? So like the second one is focal, where familiar partial epilepsy goes down, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then is that correct?
Oh, I don't remember exactly if focal is a parent of familial partial. I was just kind of choosing some examples here. This isn't meant to. This picture's not meant to represent this here.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
just one thing. So it looks that you can always use epilepsy, right? So, but let's say like by providing a category where it's where I wouldn't call it unknown, but maybe where it's not obvious from the EEG if it's focal or generalized, providing a category for these individuals would be tremendously beneficial for research. So we're doing a lot of biobank style studies where we have the whole data of UK Biobank or FinGen or whatever. So where we have data from millions of people, and of which then like 50,000 people have epilepsy. And when we do then genetic analysis, we get very much different results compared to clinical research studies. And the problem is that the labels for focal and generalized epilepsies in biobanks and clinical care are often used wrongly. Because they're billing code based, and they are often it's not that straightforward to distinguish between a focal and a generalized epilepsy often. And it's then convoluted also with billing. So if there's an opportunity to give people as a category where they don't have to commit on generalized and focal, but indicate that they looked at this carefully, but they couldn't decide. It was inconclusive. That would be tremendously useful for research.
Okay. Sabrina, I see you have your hand raised. Yeah, thanks, Dennis.
Yes. So I just wanna make sure for our notes. So the term that would be really helpful is a term that says quote unquote epilepsy. It could be anything, but we don't know if it is generalized or focal.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Because if the alternative is that they only use the higher level term, and I cannot push there as a scientist now if they really tried to look what it is, because and that would, I think, clean up also a little bit the generalized and focal categories, which are in our large biobank style research studies. They are dirty. This is very clear, and there's a lot of agreement on this. And because they are forced in always to use the generalized or focal one, because they cannot, put in it's complicated type of a category.
It's complicated, yeah. Sabrina, I'm kind of envisioning a focal or generalized that's like really clearly defined, that like EEGs have been done, but they haven't been able to conclude what the subtype is.
I need to think about what to call it. I don't like or because
I know, but I was gonna say,
it's too
yeah, that's
messy.
like,
But
You could use
it's gonna
combined,
be
right?
we need.
You could use combined, on the left,
oh, we do
this
have
So I
it.
one.
We
think
did
combined
add.
is an actual thing. Unknown
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah,
we have able to
yeah.
determine whether it's generalized or
Mhm.
focal,
It's true. It's true. It's true.
which happens a lot in my research, mainly because of the lack of access to EEG around the world, but
Oh.
happens often.
There's patients who have focal and generalized seizures. I mean that like
Yeah,
you said, that
have
is
a
a thing.
that is a real
But
thing. Yes, I don't want to put the unknowns in that category. I agree with you, Heidi. Like
Yeah,
that
it's
just
true.
makes it muddied again. Personally, I like the category of unknown, but maybe I'm the only one.
Well, I
So
think the
the
unknown.
biggest. Sorry, Nico.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, I think the unknown that we're talking about should be actually like moved over. Here, I can just quickly draw this, I think. You talk, Sabina, and let me see if I can draw real quick.
So the the problem, quote unquote, the problem with unknown, and because we're looking at an ontology, we need to really clearly define it. So we could have something that is quote unquote unknown, but we would have to define it very clearly that this term should be used when, let's say, all the tests have been done and we still don't know what type of epilepsy. So what should not happen is for somebody to have a patient and have done no test at all and say, oh, this person has a non-epilepsy. So that's why we're really, really careful with
Can,
the terms that are quote unquote unknown. But
can
if
you see
we
inconclusive?
um I think the key will be to define that term and be very clear about this term means this patient has epilepsy, these specific tests have been done, and it is still unspecified or it's still unknown. Like whatever word we want to use is fine. It's more the how we defined it. So I think that um, we will need to work on a definition and then make sure that everybody agrees on that specific definition.
the challenge here, don't you think, is the curating of this data and assigning these ontologies could be coming from a whole lot of data sources, right? You could be having surveys that are asking parents what kind of seizures are your patients having, and they're answering from their knowledge, generalized, myotonic, atonic. That this is the child problem with clinical trials that are trying to track seizures over time and specific seizure types. It puts a lot of burden on the parents, right? So if you have EEGs that have the notes and say what kind of seizures are being put into this that this patient has based on the quantification by an epileptologist, then that's
Yeah.
one kind of data. But if you have survey data and seizure quantification data from registries and other types of data, then it becomes, are there sort of guidelines that you have to put into Mondo of how when and how you can give in a specific ontology?
Yeah, so for I think for parents this doesn't work at all because most people experience different types of seizures over their lifetime, and some of them might rare. So some of them might be only focal or so, but some might be only generalized. But in general, it's very complicated, and the parents don't know this often. And so this is more like an epileptologist level grouping, which is not really helpful for the syndrome level type of holistic disease classification.
Yes, I agree. And if we think of the ontology, right, this is a tree, and it is a hierarchy. And so the lower looking at this, the lower we go, the more specific we go, the more specific it is. So if we have somebody that is, or whatever data that use the word epilepsy, we know that this patient has epilepsy, but it could be anything more specific than that. If we go lower in the ontology and we use the term, let's say, unknown type, then we are already more specific, and we might not be able to go back up the data, looking at the data. We're not going to go up into a more general term. So this is also the thing to think about when we think of ontology terms. It's a bit, it's a different way of thinking, but yeah. So my suggestion here is we will take those notes and then suggest a new terms for epilepsies where EEGs have been done and it's still inconclusive, and we'll come up with a definition, share it around, and if it works for everyone, then we'll create that term. If not, we'll go back to the drawing board. How does it sound?
Yes, sounds good.
Yeah,
Please go ahead.
certainly people who are in the unknown epilepsy category can have had EEGs. It's just that we have not been able to capture an event on EEG that helps you differentiate whether it's focal or generalized. And there would be terms under it, like, whether there's motor or non-motor symptoms, but
So
Okay,
for example,
that's helpful.
just
Super helpful.
we're doing this project now for 2.5 years, right? Where we take ClinVar like from millions of people and then linking it to epilepsy syndromes, right? The seizure type is completely irrelevant for our project. So using this to define the epilepsy by seizure type we would just run in problems if that would be our starting point. For us, Mondo becomes more helpful. So mapping the Mondos back to epilepsy becomes more helpful if we, for example, go directly to syndrome level. So many of the syndromes are genetically defined, others are structurally defined, which can also be genetic, others are metabolic, which can also be genetic. But these categories where you then split at later points into the seizure type worked for us better than if we would have started with the seizure type from the get-go, just from our perspective. But we use Mondo in general more on the syndrome level. So having a name which describes a lot of features, like a lot of HBOs. So that's how we were thinking. If we would start with the seizure, we would not get something more specific because the seizures are just a symptom.
Yeah,
You know
and the seizure should just be an HBO. Yeah. So I think we're on the same page, Dennis. That's what we're trying to do in Mondo. So
Dennis, how has neurodevelopmental groups getting new ICD-10 codes changed your syndrome, because it's SCN2A related disorders. And as they're getting their formal names, it becomes sort of more encompassing beyond the epilepsy.
But Dravet is still like a DE, right? As an example.
Yes.
So
but Dravet is their ICD-10 is an epilepsy DE code. These newer as SYNGAP and SCN2A, they're all trying to get broader neurodevelopmental codes that encompass their autism symptoms and their so how does that, as you're talking about starting from the syndrome and working down, how does updating based on the new formal code change things, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, so for our genetics project doesn't matter because the ICD codes are not really considered. But in general, I think as long as the person with SYNGAP1 still has epilepsy, you can call it DE, as long as they're cognitively challenged. This would fit the category. But if they don't, then they are, if they don't have epilepsy, then it's SYNGAP1 without, then it's more a developmental disorder without, so it's not a DE basically.
Okay, so you look at it from the scope of DEE and
No,
don't look at.
so I'm a geneticist, right? So etiology defines things for me. So that's my personal opinion, and that's why we can just say SYNGAP1, right? Genetics, and then we can split it into DE and autism if autism without seizures if we wanted to.
Yeah, that's how we would do it in Mondo
just
too.
yeah, exactly.
Also,
And in Mondo,
diagnoses.
like so just to reassure everybody, we are really looking at the classification, but in general, we can have those two types of classification. So starting with syndrome and then going into classification based on seizure type and first classification based on seizure type. So just to reassure everybody, we don't have to pick one or the other. I think right now we might already have both. If we don't have both, we'll definitely review and make sure we have several classification, because some people are geneticists and use Mondo, some people are not geneticists and also need to use Mondo for however they come in. So we'll have it all. That's all. Curtis, please go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I'm a biochemical geneticist, still has the term in there. But I live in a world where most patients don't have genetic testing still. I know it's the 90s, we feel like everyone should. Um, and our concern is all of these kids out there who parents don't know what they have, that people are trying to figure out what they have based on a seizure type. Parents feel like they have a diagnosis based on a seizure type, so do clinicians. And so like there's really salient reasons to not always start from genetics and go the other way, right? I want to, and yeah, like my diseases are developmental epileptic encephalopathies, and they're genetic and they're metabolic and they're all one syndrome. So sometimes, it's hard to start just from the syndrome.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Okay, so we have a lot of great notes about this focal, generalized focal, and generalized unknown class. We will work on this and report back to everyone. So yeah, so that's kind of the summary from the epilepsy types, and then let's go into the epilepsy by etiology. And just to recap, and we will get very shortly, we'll get to the genetic epilepsies, which I think is going to be another big discussion. But just to recap, we discussed structural epilepsy, which we discussed immune epilepsy, which we had, and metabolic epilepsy. Curtis, I can follow up with you separately. We can revisit these metabolic epilepsies and see if there's any concerns on your side.
Great.
Yeah. And so, yeah, we looked at these, and I don't think we had any big changes to them. And then we looked at, we didn't have infectious epilepsy or unknown epilepsy by etiology. We decided we didn't need an infectious epilepsy term because a lot of the causes that ILAE included in the infectious epilepsies were really just infectious diseases that had seizures as symptoms or features. So in Mondo, that's not how we do our classifications. And then we decided not to make the epilepsy of unknown etiology class. But I think now we have an opportunity if we want to revisit this. That was a really great discussion about the unknown type. Is this something that clinicians would diagnose if they said you have epilepsy, but we don't know what is the cause? Would they use a class like this? I saw you shrug, Curtis. Anyone else have any feelings about this?
I still see it in my pediatric metabolic world where clinicians still call it unknown type. Curious of the other clinicians on the call.
Sounds like maybe we don't. Sounds like this maybe not needed at the moment. We can always revisit this later too if someone comes back and says that we need a term like this.
Can you describe again the use cases of this terminology in general? Is it so because often I worked the last 10 years at surgery centers. People don't care about symptoms, about labels. They just look at all the biomarkers the whole time, right? So
Yeah.
I first time arrived being, like a naive person who grew up with syndromes, and from a genetics perspective, people were just wondering why would you use IDE names, JME, like the juvenile. No one uses this actually in clinic. Also, people would use all the biomarkers and so on. So unknown etiology is like 60% of epilepsies. You don't know why the
Yeah.
person has epilepsy.
Yeah.
But no one is writing. So it's maybe in the history it's like written somewhere in a sentence.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't see a strong use case for this. It doesn't sound like this is something that anyone would annotate. I think, yeah, if you had a case where someone was said to have epilepsy without any further description of what the cause was, you would just annotate it to epilepsy or a more specific type. So yeah, I don't really see a strong use case for this either. Okay, maybe we can move on to the next one. Um, so okay, yeah, so based on the part one discussion and what we just talked about now, I guess what I just said, yeah, we probably don't need this term, and then we can always create one later if we need to. So yeah, we did look at the metabolic epilepsy and structural epilepsies and decided that we didn't need to make any changes at the moment. So yeah, Curtis, I can follow up with you if there's anything that you see that's glaringly wrong, we can revisit those later. And then we looked at the immune epilepsy. So the immune epilepsy branch did have this antibody-mediated epilepsy as a subclass, and then a few subclasses were classified under that. But these terms actually seem to be diseases that had seizures as a feature. So we remove these subclasses as children of antibody-mediated epilepsy. I mean, the antibodies are causing the seizures, but these aren't actually types of epilepsy, they're types of other diseases. And then we also made a note on antibody-mediated epilepsy that it's included in ILAE and it groups these classes together, but these are not types of epilepsy, they're diseases with with seizures as a feature. So we kept this class just because it was an ILAE and we didn't know if people would be using it, so we didn't want to obsolete it, but we didn't think this classification was correct. And then one thing I noted when I was going through the ontology is that we also have autoimmune epilepsy. That's a subclass of epilepsy, but I think that should be a child of immune epilepsy. If anyone disagrees with that, let me know. Okay, so now the big genetic discussion. So in ILAE, they noted different genetic factors that can contribute to epilepsies. So we have, and Chris pointed out last time, they had germline under acquired gene abnormalities, but I reclassified that in this list here. So yeah, in Mondo we have, let me just go look what we have in Mondo. So what we have in Mondo right now is we have hereditary disease, so just generally, not just related to epilepsies, but which is a disease that's caused by genetic modifications where they're inherited from a parent's genome. And this is noted that this should be for inherited genetic etiologies, and somatic genetic mutations are excluded. And then we have on the hereditary disease term, we have the broad synonym, meaning it's more general, genetic disease, condition, etc. And then Mendelian disease is more specific. So in Mondo, we don't have a lot of monogenic disease classes, general monogenic disease classes. And this is a big discussion that kind of went around a few years ago about some of the difficulty in keeping this up to date. And so we do have a few classes. We have monogenic alpha thalassemia spectrum, monogenic diabetes, and monogenic epilepsy. And I just want to kind of give some background on where we're coming from and what this perspective was. So this is an old ticket, but this question came up as several years ago, asking, should we differentiate between monogenic and digenic via grouping classes in the ontology? And we later obsoleted monogenic disease because we determined it was too difficult to keep up to date. So yeah, so Chris had the question. Chris Mungall is the person who created Mondo, and he's a star ontologist. He's like one of the gurus in the field. Um, so he proposed the issue of it keeping it up to date, and it's hard to tell what's a monogenic disease versus a digenic disease. And um, he is concerned with adding a term like differentiating between monogenic, digenic, or even polygenic. If we put these terms in ontology, we want to do a good job of keeping it up to date and fully populating it. Otherwise, it'll cause a lot of confusion. So in the end, we just decided to not include a term like digenic, and we don't have a generic monogenic disease class, so we don't classify all the different types of monogenic diseases, though we do have those few examples that um, remain in the ontology. So currently in Mondo, um, as far as the epilepsy branch goes, we've added this new genetic generalized epilepsy class that's a child of generalized epilepsy. We have monogenic epilepsy in a separate branch, it's under the epilepsy branch, but in a separate kind of hierarchy too. And then this is kind of where we're at right now. So uh so we have epilepsy as a top level class. We're proposing potentially adding a new class that's genetic epilepsy. That's a broader class, a super class of hereditary epilepsy. And then genetic generalized epilepsy would be a subclass of that. And then we'd have these white boxes represent kind of diseases that will be classified under here, but we wouldn't create a class called non-hereditary epilepsy classes, but every non-hereditary epilepsy class would become a child of genetic epilepsy. And then we'd have potentially have a new hereditary epilepsy class, which by the definition would be inferred to be a child of hereditary neurological disease. And then we could put the new hereditary generalized epilepsy class that we created under here. Monogenic epilepsy class would go under here. And then all the other polygenic epilepsies or hereditary epilepsies that are due to chromosomal abnormalities would be classified under here, but not grouped together. So I'm curious to see what everyone thinks about this.
I have tons of comments. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Bring them on, please.
So this is ultra important to get right because just almost the majority of epilepsies have a genetic contribution, and the number of monogenic ones is increasing on a weekly basis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just for major comment, if you go 3 slides back to the overall definition of one more. Yeah, there's this one. So here's super important, it was so it will be surprising for those who are not epilepsy pros that many people can be diagnosed, particularly kids, and with a single genetic variant, and this can be up to 60% depending on how well you sequence. But they are not hereditary, so these are de novo disorders, and it should, so where it's written here, somatic are excluded, there should also be de novo be excluded. These are sporadic disorders. Most of the genetic epilepsies are sporadic. Super important. So, which is affecting then also 3 slides later your tree, right? So it's the monogenic ones will most oftenly not be up-rolled to hereditary. They will up-roll to sporadic disease.
Yeah.
And that is 9 out of 10 times, or actually 19 out of 20 times the case when for genetic diagnosis. So
can I ask a question of you, Dennis, before you go on to the next part?
Sure.
So the part is like putting my clinician hat on, is that I do think that they're de novo, right? So they weren't inherited, but then they could be inherited by the next generation, right? So
90% of this epilepsy, so it could be, but 90% of patients with a genetic epilepsies have reduced fecundity, so the disease severity through evolutionary pressure is so bad they cannot have children.
Sure, but we're getting really a lot better at it, right? As my main work is focused on treatment of these disorders.
I hope so, but just realistic.
Just as a thought process is, does that change over time because it is not inherited from a parent, but it would be inherited in another generation.
Yeah. So, it could be. And also for every gene, there's also like a mild version which is inherited, right? So it's like typically the rare end of the gene spectrum. But but most are really severe developmental disorders, where most people at this point in time will not live to a life where they have children. So that's unfortunately it.
So before we go any further, I want to answer the de novo mutations. The way we created this, and Nicole, please let me know if we got it wrong or if it is not in Mondo yet. The idea is to have a general class that is right now we call genetic epilepsy. That basically means it's due to a variation in any gene, but it could also be anything that is genetic related. More specific, so the children term would be hereditary. So we have that class that is it has been inherited. But then we will have the other class that we might or might not, we don't know yet, have a grouping class for that. But like all the other de novo mutations would be under genetic, but not under hereditary. So we would still have a grouping class for all those variations, but we would make the distinction between this one was hereditary, this one was a de novo.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? Okay. So I think we're on the same page.
Yeah. And related to keeping up with genes, for example, you mentioned this problem that that's why it's not so detailed populated at the moment. Actually, this others doing the job for you. So if you look at ClinGen or the GeneCC consortium, they are using Mondo, right? And they are assigning Mondo terms with different level of gene disease validity, from supportive to conclusive to rejected, and using Mondo terms to describe the disease. You can just pull from there. So then you can take it in here, and then you have it, and that will update then automatically with the curation efforts from ClinGen or the GeneCC which effort.
Yeah, we work very closely with ClinGen, and we try to incorporate all their.
So then you get gene level categories for okay, good.
Yeah, and we also pull from OMIM too. Their gene.
Yeah, but OMIM is not good. So because OMIM is more researchy, right? So it's so maybe separate, right? So let's call it like this.
Yeah.
So it's whereas for clinical purposes, the GeneCC database and or ClinGen are the ones to go for clinical purposes. OMIM it could be more wide, let's call it like this.
Sure. Yeah. So do we have any further questions about the genetic structure here? Or are we good for now? I think we need to propose this to Chris too, Sabrina, because this kind of affects the rest of the ontology, because we'd want to do this for all the diseases.
Yes, definitely.
So it's important we want to make is this is incredibly, and that's probably the biggest contribution you can have for the biggest problem in epilepsy precision medicine over the next 10 years. So this is really important to bring this in, because at the moment it's impossible to identify patients who would benefit from precise therapy. People try it with ICD codes, but we have studies going on. People don't use ICD codes. So this is not solving it, but if people would use in these syndrome level classifications, which would go along with a gene in the future, or could go along with a gene, that would facilitate clinical trials and therapeutics tremendously.
Awesome. We love that. We would love to make a big contribution like that. So yeah, we'll work on this very carefully and we'll confer with everyone before we implement these changes. But yeah, we'll work on this. Do you have another comment?
And just to reassure everyone, we are already working on this. We work very closely with ClinGen, so we are adding grouping based on the gene affected in a lot of places in the ontology. I don't know for the epilepsy branch specifically. I don't remember seeing something recently, but we are working
Yeah.
on
So
getting
I
that.
believe
So
the point I just want to make is it's really important to get to the gene level, just because of therapeutics. So because there will be others who will then do the ICD to Phi codes to Mondo kind of mappings, and suddenly we have it, right? And so we know which patient should get which therapy, and for all kinds of clinical trial enrollment and whatever insurance claims, epidemiological research. It's all impossible at the moment. So really not trying the genes is what we need for the new therapies.
Yeah.
Where they are, right? Otherwise you go with syndromes. But
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on from this. So yeah, next we have epilepsy syndromes. Good segue. So yes, so we have a class in Mondo that's called epilepsy syndrome, which is currently undefined. So one of the questions is, how do we define epilepsy syndrome? Should epilepsy be a major feature, or should epilepsy be one of the features? And we have this definition from ILAE here. Should we add this as a definition, or should we have some kind of revised definition? So they define it as characteristic cluster of clinical and EEG features, supported by other etiological findings. That's kind of the main gist of it, grouped together by age of onset and epilepsy type. Should we use a definition kind of based on this? Does that make sense?
Can I ask a question?
Please.
So for me, Mondo is not specific to a disease domain. So I don't know how to answer your question for this one because it's not clear for the following scenario. Patient, so let's say child, 3 years old, doesn't speak. It goes to a psychologist, gets the definition of autism, has the first seizure, gets by the neurologist a label for it's, I don't know, call it like whatever, generalized epilepsy, whatever. So and then goes to a geneticist, calls it GRIN2A. So GRIN2A aphasia or whatever, autism aphasia syndrome. So so you have now 3 different providers, and then you have the parent, right? So what should Mondo tackle here now?
That's a good question.
So no, because if you ask from epilepsy perspective, I can give you the epilepsy answer, but the psychologist would not call it like that.
Yeah. It really probably would depend on who's annotating the data. They would be the ones making the call. But yeah, it's a great question.
So in terms of what do we call it? And I would love to hear from other people, because obviously one thing I didn't say about me, I am not a clinical person. So I don't know anything about patients. But so what we try to do in Mondo, if the disease is the same, and I always say that, and it's a little bit silly, but it is very true. It doesn't matter what you call it. If it is the same disease, it can have 500 names. All the names are going to be there. It's going to be the same disease. In this specific situation, and like what we're asking here is, when somebody has, quote unquote, an epilepsy syndrome, what does it mean for the clinician? That is, does it mean that there's more than one feature and epilepsy is one of them? Does it mean that epilepsy is the major feature? And so this is, looking at it also from a diagnosis perspective. If you have a patient that has epilepsy and have a lot of other things, then you would probably look for diagnosis like in this category, whether you know the genes or you don't know the gene, like, all of these. So that's what I just wanted to say. Curtis, you have your hand up.
I was going to say some of the same things, Sabrina. Like, there are still epilepsy syndromes that are dominated by epilepsy. I guess my best examples are Norse and Fires. where it is predominantly epilepsy. No one's been able to find significant genetic causes thus far for the majority of them, but by classifying them in these syndromes, we are able to provide some prognostic information, some general recommendations for treatments about things to avoid. And so I think this is still an important category. And as a genetics person, I think at some point in the future, hopefully we'll be able to figure out like these are actually 10 different syndromes, genetic conditions, and they all have different things. But in 2024, I think this is still a really important category focused on epilepsy as the primary syndrome and not a condition that also sometimes has epilepsy
Yeah,
or
but
seizures.
yes, but only for the examples like you just presented. And for example, Dravet syndrome is another one where it makes sense. So because we had like the study like 5 years ago in Nature Genetics where we compared the top genes in the autism studies and the top genes in the developmental epileptic encephalopathy studies, and then the rate of genes where they're positive. Long story short, there's some genes which stick out, which are primarily considered more epilepsy type of disorders, and there's 150 genes that fits. But there are way more disorders where it's very blurry, where the seizures are just a part of a wider spectrum and so on. But the unfortunate thing is, for me, it's not so straightforward. So the examples you brought, I fully agree. But where to make the cutoff? So it's probably a larger. I don't know if there's a good resource to refer towards. But yes, syndromes make sense, and particularly when there's no genetics. And but with the moment the genetics are there, often but not always, they become less epilepsy specific.
Heidi pointed out that some of the patient advocacy leaders may have some opinions here. Like Vanessa, do you have anything?
Yeah, so there's a lot of opinions in this space because I think it depends. We mentioned this last time, Curtis. I know you weren't here. It's what does Mondo want to what does Mondo want to be used as, right? So in the case of like the structuring and the usability of the data, it's who's going to be using the Mondo ontologies versus necessarily how the advocates are there. Because oftentimes, because of the comorbidities that you're seeing in this space, even epilepsy is the primary, right? Epilepsy syndrome is the primary aspect of their disorder. The etiologies that they're also being diagnosed with become part of their being, right? Because if we're going to be starting to pull data records that are talking about the neurodevelopmental disorders that are related to that epilepsy, or perhaps like the physical aspects of it, or the muscle aspects of it, where it might not be the primary issue, how would Mondo take that into account, right? Because then how do those things connect in the actual Mondo system? And then because like that's what the advocates and the communities are going to ask, like, how are you representing my child in Mondo? Because they are all going to be similar to HPO. They're a constellation of HPO terms that don't always meet all of their needs, and they change over time. Same thing goes for some of the, I didn't mention this, but same thing goes for the monogenic stuff right now, because people are constantly going back to get new genetic testing. As genetic testing expands, they might not remain like a monogenic condition based upon how the new testing works out. But I don't know that we need to like go down that path yet, or kick the can down the road until like whole long read sequencing is in place. But it's one of those things, like when it comes down to the advocates, they want their person represented with all things considered. And most of the time now, people are not, like, the communities are not going for epilepsy forward. They're not going full NDD forward. They really do want it to be represented as everything that their child or their person is experiencing. But I know that that's not like, the use of Mondo, like they're not going to go into Mondo and find these things, but how do we kind of like reconcile that in like an LLM model? Like if they go in and they start looking into the data that's there, would an LLM model on the Mondo ontology pull out what they're actually looking for?
Yeah. I mean, I think all the definitions should encompass all the terms that they're looking for. Farther down the slide deck, which I don't think we're going to get to today, we also have questions about how do we classify these syndrome terms? Like, should we be classifying something that's a collection of features as a type of epilepsy if epilepsy is just one of the features of it? And that's another question that we'll have to get to later. But I don't know if we really answered this question here about the epilepsy syndrome, but maybe we can look at some other more specific examples in here. So we have the epilepsy syndrome grouping class, and then we have some subtypes that are in ILAE, such as what Alina had pointed out earlier. Like we used to have the kind of adolescent onset. Now we have the variable onset. But yeah, let's look at these age-specific onset terms that we have in the ILAE. So yeah, so we have the childhood onset epilepsy syndrome. We don't have a lot of these terms under, and we don't have a lot of these grouping classes in Mondo. And the question is, oops, so we can expand it. The question is, do we need these grouping classes? And yeah, in the next slide, we can expand this hierarchy and see what this looks like. So, I'm really reassured to hear that ILE is not like the Bible and we don't need to follow them precisely. So this actually like, kind of answers a lot of questions for me already. But so the terms in orange here are what we have in Mondo, and then the terms in blue are what we propose to add to Mondo. And then ILAE does groups by kind of these different terms, but these don't really make sense as these terms here in black don't really make sense as epilepsy or as ontology terms per se. So but there's several classes here that we don't have in Mondo that I think would be relevant to add, especially if people are using this terminology, like the childhood onset self-limited focal epilepsy syndrome. And yeah, there's a bunch of these here. So just kind of looking at this, does anyone have any objections to adding these terms as proposed here? Okay, and then there's a question about the epilepsy with myoclonic atonic seizures. So I have a specific question about that coming up. So it sounds like we can add these terms in. These sounds like they're being used by at least the ILAE community, maybe beyond. So that sounds like it'd be relevant.
Would
and then
would idiopathic, sorry, one question and clarification. Would the idiopathic
Yeah.
childhood onset, the idiopathic, when we talked about idiopathic last time, would that be, so now does it have the other parent of idiopathic generalized epilepsy as well as the childhood onset epilepsy in the structure? Because if we're using that term, idiopathic epilepsy, regardless of onset age, how would those connect?
Yeah, we could add this as
Yeah, that one.
Oh,
that
actually,
one.
that's a really good question, because I think well, yeah, I guess since we're not strictly sticking to what they have done, but yeah, when we talked last time, we said that the idiopathic generalized epilepsy had those 4 specific children, but I think it would, well, we
Because
also differentiate
I mean,
though.
Curtis made a comment before about
Yeah.
this, like idiopathic is not unspecified, right? So
Yeah.
we talked about maybe going back and looking at like going back to our discussion last time, how you want to deal with idiopathic. But if we're going to put idiopathic generalized epilepsy in that child, you'd want to make sure the parent is also idiopathic epilepsy.
Yeah. I think we do differentiate though between epilepsy syndrome and then epilepsy by type, kind of like how they do in ILAE. So because we have, I guess we can just look at here. Yeah, because this one would be a child of the epilepsy syndrome, and versus the idiopathic generalized epilepsy was a child of generalized epilepsy, wasn't it? So they would kind of be in 2 different branches because we're differentiating the syndromes and the types. But if that doesn't make sense, then we don't necessarily have to do it that way. Oops. Do you know what I mean, Vanessa? Does it make sense?
No, it makes sense. I'm just wondering if there's if there's any response to this in terms of like if they like Curtis, especially because you're a pediatric neurologist.
Not a neurologist, a geneticist.
Sorry, geneticist, but a clinician. Apologies.
Do you have any comments on this, Curtis, or do you think?
I mean, I think
okay if we keep him.
Yeah, I think we're all going to have different thoughts about really what from it, like, the geneticist in me always wants to understand idiopathic epilepsy more, right? And then there's other categories, like my tree, much different from Mondo's tree, is like 25% of idiopathic epilepsy responds to paradoxine. So I'm like, oh, what do those kids have? that the others don't, because there's 9 genetic causes of paradoxine dependency. They don't have those. So like you can continue going down that tree in different ways. But I think idiopathic epilepsy is a common pediatric description of epilepsies if we're going to start trying to categorize patients, and it should be there.
Okay, sounds good. Should we move on to the next slide?
Can I ask
Or-
this question again? I'm sorry, just
Yeah.
for my own education. You know, I'm sorry to disrupt all the time, but you know, my goal is that at the end, you know, to have something which is overcoming current problems. So if someone at the moment is 3 years old, has myoclonic atonic seizures and developmental stagnation, and has a very nasty one, we call it Dravet syndrome, right? So that if someone with Dravet syndrome shows up by the age of 25, the syndrome name is okay. Everyone feels comfortable saying this is Dravet syndrome in a 25-year-old. If someone would be labeled by childhood absence seizures, but the person is 30 years old, where the people would not use that word. The information might not be there anymore when the onset of the absences were after they had like 5 referrals or as an adult now. How does this help? So how does that fall into the Mondo thing? So is Mondo like at that point in time type of syndrome level description, and then later on you have to figure out which Mondo names from pediatrics match to partially map or map to the Mondo names in an adult, and then we get the links, or what is the intent?
Yeah, you know, ontologies in general don't do a very good job with dealing with like disease progression. So it's kind of
the
like
Dravet one would cover it.
Yeah.
People feel comfortable calling Dravet in adults and Dravet in children. Just you know.
Yeah. Sabrina, do you want to comment?
Yes. So when we look at the definition for the Mondo term childhood onset epilepsy, the definition would probably be something like an epilepsy that had an onset in childhood. I know it's circular, but you know, stay with me. So if you're an adult, or if the patient is an adult and they had epilepsy that was that started in childhood, then yes, there would be a diagnosis of childhood onset. Now, that being said, I understand that nobody will have in the charts, you know, this patient is 30-year-old, they have childhood onset epilepsy. They would probably have something more specific that would be like Dravet syndrome. And Dravet syndrome, we know because of the ontology that the onset of the epilepsy was in childhood. So even though we would not have the quote unquote label childhood onset epilepsy, we would know that whatever this person has is classified as a childhood onset epilepsy because this epilepsy started in childhood. Does it make sense? So it's all about the definition and the classification.
I understand this, but this example of the Dravet syndrome versus childhood onset epilepsy argues for me that when one has the choice, one should always go for the more syndrome level description, which doesn't have an age trigger associated with.
That is, yes. Every time you diagnose anybody, you should go with the most specific term, definitely. And so if Dravet syndrome is defined as, and let me make it very clear, defined as being onset in childhood, then this information comes for free. Now, if Dravet syndrome is sometimes childhood onset, sometimes not, then we would not have any classification based on epilepsy onset.
Okay, so with all this in mind, you know, for me personally, and thinking from a clinical gene therapy, whatever perspective, having where we can the syndrome level, if it may it be the gene name, may it be the syndrome, which is strongly correlated with the gene involved in Mondo will make Mondo more valuable. It doesn't need to be always when there is no gene yet, or people don't use genetic testing yet to the degree. I agree with Curtis. But if we can, having like the etiology defined label promoted here would make this very valuable.
Okay, good to know. Alina, you have a question?
Yeah, to Dennis's note and to parallel with Dravet syndrome. Dravet syndrome was previously defined as severe myoclonic epilepsy in infancy. So there was a label infancy before, just because we know that it started in infancy, and then just because there is an eponymic term that probably is less age specific because we know that it's a lifelong process, Dravet syndrome was preferred, although eponymic names overall are not the mainstay or not go-to when we are talking about syndromes. Yeah, but it still was deemed to be more appropriate. So yeah, for childhood absence epilepsy, we just don't have anything in particular, and I agree with this age label here that it usually lasts through the childhood and do not progress further unless it's an atypical childhood absence epilepsy, in which case it would be labeled atypical absence.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
later on
and
we
they
would
have
anyways GGE in the adults, right? So so here's a clear transition of the term to, and this is actually under the syndrome level. So that's so the CAE is a part of the GGE spectrum, and this is all under a syndrome category.
mm-hmm.
Dennis,
That
I
makes
have a
sense.
question for you. If we're curating with OMOP and then the Mondo, and you're doing some of your prediction analyses, does it benefit you to see that there was some sort of childhood onset that but this patient didn't get the Dravet diagnosis until age 25? So to follow the trajectory sort of you put out a paper recently, right? On some of the on I believe it was Dravet, right? The time length of time from seizures and the clinical outcomes for these patients with diagnosis for Dravet. So would these be beneficial for research purposes if there was a Mondo term that they knew this patient had seizures and had some sort of syndrome, but the actual diagnosis did not happen? So if we were curating a data set that had that longitudinality to it.
For example, like presumed genetic epilepsy syndrome, or what do you mean?
Well, we were talking about the childhood onset epilepsy syndrome. So I mean that Curtis had alluded to that, hour one as we were talking about. Some of these are things that are uncertainties that get put on the chart before the clinicians know the true underlying etiology. So yes, the most specific one is the one we ought to go with, but for research purposes and some of the predictive algorithms and things that you have, and if you were to apply LLM, if we had Mondo, OMOP and Mondo attached to a group of patients in a natural history study, that for whatever reason, I don't know why we would have them followed if they weren't, but maybe they're EHR or what have you. And we had that identified that 20 years ago or 22 years ago, this person did have a recognized epilepsy syndrome, but it took this long before a diagnosis was returned. Would it benefit any of the work that you're doing with prediction?
Yeah, I think so, because the etiology defined the diagnosis, which often people take on later. They're always delayed, right? So and just encouraging people to do earlier genetic testing when you can demonstrate this. I mean, the best example is someone who has a prolonged febrile seizure. They get maybe the febrile seizure label, and then they have the myoclonic seizure. Then they may have myoclonic seizures, myoclonic epilepsy, and then they do genetic testing, and then suddenly it's Dravet syndrome, right? So it's like 3 steps until Dravet syndrome, and if you're unlucky, people wait 2 years, and then you have developmental stagnation, and I think so maybe that's the whole time while I'm talking. I'm sorry for this. Some of these terms are clinically useful, and all of these terms are clinically useful, and they should be there. But some of them are often used currently because they're just a precursor of something, and they're not they act as HBO almost, and yeah. So, but Mondo doesn't want to be HBO. And that's why somehow encouraging the holistic disease label, maybe genetic or clinical syndrome, would be good. And I don't exactly know how to encourage this, because otherwise it becomes HBO in a way.
Yeah. Like we're just kind of diagnosing the symptoms as they appear. Yeah.
HBO epilepsy, right? So because you use all the epilepsy HBOs basically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Should we move on to the next one? Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so in addition to the terms in ILAE, we have a lot of childhood onset epilepsy syndrome subclasses in here that are depicted here with a star. So I propose that we revisit these after we kind of implement some of these new terms into Mondo that are in the ILAE missing from Mondo. So if that's okay, we'll just come back to this one later. And then I have this question. You mentioned myoclonic atonic epilepsy. So we have this term myoclonic atonic epilepsy in Mondo, and then it looks like this is the equivalent term as the epilepsy with myoclonic atonic seizures in ILAE. And then we also have in Mondo, we have myoclonic ecstatic epilepsy. And I think these two terms are the same based on a lot of overlapping definitions. Because this ecstatic has exact synonyms of myoclonic atonic, epilepsy with myoclonic atonic seizures coming from both a paper reference and then Orphanet, and another one from Orphanet. So does anyone have any thoughts or knowledge if these two are the same diseases and they can be merged together? Dennis, are you familiar with this ecstatic term, or Curtis?
Here, but I've only ever heard myoclonic ecstatic epilepsy as related to Deuce syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an exact synonym on the myoclonic ecstatic. Or maybe, is Deuce syndrome separate from myoclonic atonic though?
I'm gonna defer to maybe Alina. Do you know?
Oh, here it says in the ILAE, they say epilepsy with myoclonic atonic seizures previously known as Deuce syndrome. So that makes me think that these are the same. Yeah, Alina, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So static and atonic are essentially synonyms as far as I'm concerned, and as far as all my mentors have been concerned. I also had the same question. It is the Deuce syndrome, myotonic, atonic, or myoclonic, sorry, aesthetic epilepsy or seizures. They are all the same as far as my knowledge goes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we will propose to merge these two together, and it'll take a few months before we execute on that.
This is one of this. By the way, this is a good example of a syndrome where the syndrome name is overlapping with one or few genes quite well. So SSC6A1 is the gene which comes up. So it makes sense not to use SSC6A1 syndrome because it's not one-to-one, but many people with that syndrome and have specifically SSC6A1 variants. So and the problem is not everyone does testing, right? So what Curtis meant makes a lot of sense. But if we would have this Mondo term, that would be one of the few good clinical words you can use to ascertain for a clinical trial patients who would benefit from a GABA transporter upregulator.
Okay, cool. Okay, we have only about 15 minutes left, or about less than 15 minutes now. So yeah, let's keep going. And then, yeah, we're definitely not going to get through everything. So some of the things maybe that seem straightforward, maybe I'll just follow up. Is everybody, is, I know you all are not on GitHub currently, or if you are, I don't have your handle. Are you all comfortable using GitHub? Would you be okay if we just created tickets on GitHub and maybe tagged you on some to add input? Or we could also send emails to people too if GitHub's not your jam. But some of the things that are more straightforward, I might just try to propose on GitHub and then implement. But then I think we're going to definitely want to schedule another workshop like this, because this has been incredibly valuable to have all of your input. And yeah, clearly a lot of these questions are just not straightforward and easy to answer. So yeah, I'll keep going through a few more examples here before we need to adjourn today, and then we'll follow up with you and try to get something scheduled in the new year if you're all willing to come back together and do this with us again. We're very appreciative of your time. Okay, so next we have neonatal infantile epilepsy syndrome. So in Mondo we have both neonatal epilepsy syndrome and neonatal infantile epilepsy syndrome. And I think that these should be combined. Anyone have any objections to that? Okay.
Yeah. So I wouldn't combine them. So there's very
Oh, you would not
different.
combine them? Okay.
There's very different etiologies between those who have seizures like in the first day and to like 4 days of life, compared to those who develop seizures after 6 months. It's very different biology and just also from the NICU stay and all these things which are hospital relevant. I would definitely not put them together. These different things.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And then we have these grouping classes in ILAE, the self-limited epilepsy syndrome and the neonatal infantile with DEE. Do they seem like relevant grouping classes to include?
Makes sense.
If
One's
they-
better, good, right? So
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Okay, we'll proceed to do that and then not
and
merge
it's
those other
typically,
two.
sorry. So there's typically people speak also from a third category. So self-limiting might refer to, the epilepsy goes away, right? So self-limiting, it's always typically it refers to the epilepsy. But there often we use also the word neonatal infantile benign epilepsy, which
okay.
is distinguished between self-limiting because self-limiting might reduce the epilepsy, but they still have a developmental hit. And whereas the benign one would be had seizures at birth, whatever, and then they're good, nothing happened later.
So that's
And
we
this
have
is
some of the
typically
benign
used.
terms, but
Yeah.
yeah. We have some of the benign terms, but is there anything missing here?
Oh, so sorry. Didn't look right.
Oh, no problem. Okay, that looks okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we also have orange is in Mondo and the blue is not in Mondo. So we propose adding these new terms and grouping them in this way. And then just to note, we're not going to get to this today, but there's a lot of questions about the DEEs. So that's something that we can revisit in the future. But I think we can go ahead probably and add these new grouping classes to cover what is in ILAE if no one has any objections. Okay, and then looking at the variable age onset epilepsy syndrome. So yeah, like Alina said earlier, that this is like a new kind of classification that they've added to ILAE instead of having the adolescent onset. So we have the variable age onset epilepsy syndrome. I think we should classify it. Currently, it's just under epilepsy, but I think it should go under epilepsy syndrome to align with ILAE and rename it to, currently it's called variable age onset epilepsy, but then rename it to include syndrome. And then they have the terms that are Mondo in orange and the black are terms that are in ILAE. They have a lot of grouping terms that we don't have. If there's not any objections, we can go ahead and add these grouping classes too to align with ILAE. And then there's a question about the epilepsy with auditory features. So we have so yeah, we'll add the variable age onset focal epilepsy syndrome, and then we have we propose to add a new term, epilepsy with auditory features. That's a child of this. And then we have autosomal dominant epilepsy with auditory features, which I think is the same as the familial EAF and ALE. And then propose to merge that with the child term, the adolescent adult onset autosomal dominant epilepsy with auditory features. And that seems to be the same term. The latter is from ILA only, but that seems to be the same term, and the naming convention seems to be no longer used. It also says it typically has an onset of 10 to 30 years. So I think it's okay to merge it into a variable age class since it's not definitively adolescent adult onset. If no objections to that, we can proceed with that. And then so in the epilepsy syndrome branch, there's several classes that are not in the ILAE, but we have in Mondo, so we can look at those. And Sabrina's asking that if we can use the last 5 minutes to wrap up. Let's do that. So this is probably a big topic. So yes, let's do that. Let's stop here. Let me get out of my slides and see if I have a wrap-up slide. It seems a lot of slides left. Let's discuss our next steps. And Sabrina, do you have specific questions? You asked if there's anything specific that people want to discuss.
Yes, I don't have anything specific. First of all, thank you everyone for all your input and the discussions. We have a lot of notes, so we will follow up internally and make some changes in Mondo, propose some more changes as we review all of these notes. So there's still a lot of work to do. What I wanted to hear from all of you is any feedback you have in terms of if there's something specific that we have not discussed and that you think we should have discussed or we should discuss in a part 3. Obviously, we already knew from the previous workshop that we needed a part 3. So I would like to hear about if there's something we haven't discussed that you think we should really have on our radar. If there's something specific that we have discussed and you think that we should review it as a group and discuss it any further instead of everybody looking at them at it separately. So the floor is open. Please, please
Dennis,
share your thoughts.
So it's not clear to me if the proposed Mondo epilepsy ontology will have, for example, CDKL5 related epilepsy as an item, or SLC61 related epilepsy, because it would be tremendously helpful if it could, just from a therapeutic perspective and so on. Yeah.
And yes, it can. I don't think that we have that right now, but we definitely can add these. The way when we add those terms, we work with mostly the clinician team who tells us these are the terms that we need because these are the terms that make sense. So if we can work with you or any other group who can tell us these are the terms with all the genes related epilepsy, these are the things that we would need to see, then definitely we can add that in the ontology. At this point, I think we haven't had that request and we don't know what makes sense to add. So
We do have a
definitely
lot
we
of
will have
gene
that.
related. Yeah, we do have a lot of gene related terms off the top of my head. I don't know if we have CDLK5, but
Yeah,
yeah,
there must
I
be
can see
there
what
must be
you're saying.
100 which are curated in ClinGen. More than 100
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, yeah. Chris?
Hello, everybody. Because I am a ClinGen curator for the epilepsy GSEP, I would like to note that this is something that the panel does not really like. I know, and I am completely in line with what it said here, that using the gene-related disease would be very helpful, but for some reason that I'm not really sure I can explain, this is not very well tolerated by the panel. I don't know if there's a change of view, but
Because Ingo is an epileptologist, not a geneticist. That's why.
oh,
Oh,
no,
but
I'm not.
Heather should be more strong. So, but okay.
I am not getting there. Maybe that's kind of true in terms of it's the way that we view things. We are geneticists, we have our view. They are epileptologists, they have their view. So we have to find a way to combine things. But
Yeah,
I am completely in line with Dennis that it would be very helpful to have the gene-related disease. But the
yeah,
actual question is, what is the scope of it? Because we find this helpful because when we go through diagnosis or research, we would like to see things in terms of genetics. So it's much more helpful for us.
yes, Chris, that's interesting what you say because we work with a lot of the ClinGen expert panels, and a lot of the other ones do like having gene-related disease names. So, and like you just said, we can find a happy medium. We can add them. We can add these terms. We can add them as synonyms to terms too. So we, it might be the case that we have gene-related diseases, epilepsies, but they're maybe not named as such in Mondo, so they might actually exist. So we can take a look at that too at a later time point and make sure that we have everything represented that is relevant. And we are at time. I don't know if anyone else has any final comments. Just one
I
more comment. Oh, go on, Heidi.
to speak to what Chris said, and I think Vanessa alluded to regarding the scope. Are we going to kind of, if we're working from the genetic, because CPATH, it handles rare disorders, right? And so
Mhm.
that's where we're starting from, and ILE handles all epilepsies. So, and I know that Mondo has an interest in updating what they have with all epilepsies, but is there moving beyond seizures? And if we start looking at these genetic epilepsies, the phenotypes and ontologies that develop that are non-seizure outcomes. So sleep, GI, motor impairment, the where you could use it to look at the heterogeneity within and across disorders.
Mhm. Yeah,
I mean,
and Mondo,
what you've done already is like huge. You know, I realize it's a big undertaking that you're doing, but I think that
yeah,
that's what the industry sponsors and the patient advocates are really excited about the data
yeah,
being used.
yeah. And this those aspects should be represented in Mondo and HPO too. And also, if there's any changes or issues with those, we can always go back and revisit that as well, and revise those as well. One final comment is that on Friday, December 13th, we have our Mondo outreach calls, and I'll be doing a recap of what we've talked about so far in the epilepsy workshop. So you are all welcome to join, and Sarah can make sure that you're on the mailing list to receive those invitations. And then, yeah, we'll follow up with you all and try to get something scheduled for the new year to keep the discussions going. And then, yeah, ultimately, we would like to write a community authored manuscript about our workshop and our decision process and how we've represented epilepsy in Mondo. So you all be invited to be authors, and we won't be able to start the outline of the manuscript until we get through all the open questions. But this is something that I hope that we can get done in like the next year or so. So those are some of the ultimate outcomes of this work.